Okay, so today we're gonna read a little more of this with about Henry, the King of England, and then go on to, I believe the next one mentioned often lately has been Louis the Sixth, who is they call him Louis the Gross, and yes, that means in French that means large, but oddly, he only became large after 40, so he wasn't large in the beginning. And I wanted to show you the coin here. This is him on the coin in the beginning, and then later on he did become quite hefty. So what it was, we don't know why he gained the weight, but he's not the only one called Le Gros, or the Fat. And so I want to kind of go through, because I know that bothers a lot of people who might be heavy. This was his wife, by the way. So it wasn't her fault. Did she feed him wrong foods? You can blame her. But no, I have a list here of the fats. And it's like, what the heck? They were all called the Fat. Yeah. Every one of these. So they were, they used that personal, description, that really applies to the person, isn't it? That's the fat one. And well, we've got Fat King, whatever, so we'll call him the Fat. You can imagine how they're doing that. And already going through all of these, I believe Charles the Fat, I already mentioned when we were into the Merovingians, getting into the Carolingians. Charles the Fat, I believe, was a Carolingian or Carlovingian. But yeah, he was also possibly heavy, and I don't know when his heavyweight came on, but we have popes here that were called the Fat, Guy le Gros. So, I mean, you can say maybe it was, the stature moment, that, the fat, that, it wasn't a bad thing that they weren't exercising, or maybe that just more weight to pull around, don't mess with me. Maybe that was part of it. Part of, the stature of being a diplomat in Europe. They were respected more for the weight. That we've got a hefty pope, so maybe that didn't help. We've got a hefty Duke of Brittany. All of this is going on. We have Floris of Holland is a heftier one. Well, Pope Clement was after. Sorry, it was after. So we're looking at the 1-1 time, the 1-1 time. So yeah, with Floris of Holland was a hefty. Who else? Humbert, Count of Savoy, passed away. So, and they don't have easy time of it when they're heavy in these back in those ages. It was very difficult. Especially because they wore so much cloth. It wasn't. I mean, right now our clothes are relatively easy. If you have to go to the toilet or something. Back then, it's just like, what? No, they had all these different jackets, and maybe they had some kind of special string on their pants. I don't know, but it would have been difficult to be heavier, I think. And yes, the way of fighting, they were all fighting, and so fighting when you're heavy, you're leaving yourself at a disadvantage. And as well, you can't use a sword or a foil, fighting a duel. You're just leaving yourself almost to say, well, I don't have to fight, somebody else will fight for me. And it kind of it softens you as a leader, doesn't it? As a warrior leader, it just takes your warrior away and says, well, he's going to have somebody else do it. So maybe he's not really that strong, and if you can get past his warriors, then he'll be easy to take out. So in a way, I don't think it's a good thing to be rousing yourself as you were the fat, that you have all that protection of all your warriors. I still think from the point of view of your enemy, it'll be like, well, if you can get past them, you can get to him, and it's done. So anyway, to let you know, so we have Leopold also here. Louis VI here, as we were discussing. Humbert of Savoy. Who else? But I thought that was kind of cute that they had a list of the fats. They also have a list of the stouts as well. But we have Welf of Bavaria. Duke of Bavaria was a Welf II. He was a heavy. Who else? Yeah, I mean, if you want to put yourself at possible, like a rollover, essentially, that you would be easy to be removed from power. I don't think it was a wise thing. I think a king should always be exercised, be on his horse, be on out there, near the walls, be working, a working one rather than one that just hangs back and almost hides away, So there we are. So I'll go on. I'll leave you at not the portrait of her, because, well, there she was. Which was her name? Let's see. Lilth de. No, I don't think. I think it was something else, not Alix. Alex. They're calling her Alex, the wife of Louis VI. So let's see what else I've got on the. All right, so we'll head on to. Yeah, I don't know why I brought that up. Anyway, so back to the exercise self. No, we're sitting here reading and listening, so we're not exercising right now. That's for sure. Yeah, do take breaks. If you have to listen to every word, take breaks. You can always pause it, get up and exercise or something. It's always good for your heart. All right, so Henry knew how to defend the rights of his crown with vigor, and yet with address. He had sent over the English bishops to attend this synod, but at the same time had cautioned them that if the foreign pontiff or the ecclesiastics would be induced to advance any farther pretensions, he was fully determined strictly to adhere to the laws and the customs of England, and to maintain undiminished those legal prerogatives of royalty which had been transmitted to him by his predecessors. "Go," said he, to the prelates at their departure, "salute the Pope in my name. Pay attention to his apostolic precepts. But be careful to bring back none of his new inventions with you in my dominions." Finding, however, it would be a matter of greater facility to him to elude than to oppose the efforts of Calixtus, he gave his ambassadors private instructions to gain the pontiff and his favourites by liberal presents and tempting promises. By a sagacious application of these convincing arguments. They found means to prevail on the council to treat with neglect the well-founded complaints of the Norman prince. Some time after, Calixtus went to Gifford, where he had a long conference with Henry, in which he intimated that it was the desire of the council that Robert should be restored to his dominions. Henry replied that it was not from his brother he had taken Normandy, but from a nefarious band of depredators, who were consuming the inheritance of his ancestors, which the imprudence of Robert had delivered into their hands, as likewise added that in taking possession of that duchy he had not acted in compliance with the dictates of avarice or ambition, but in consequence of the earnest and repeated solicitations of the nobility, clergy, and people of Normandy, who had besought him with the most strenuous supplications to prevent the utter desolation of the church. These ridiculous reasons he took care to strengthen with the same arguments which had been employed by his ambassadors at the Council of Rheims, and they had so powerful an effect upon the Pope and the cardinals who attended him that they declared on their return that of all the men whom they had conversed with in the whole course of their lives, the King of England was the most eloquent and persuasive. Calixtus, having by this means been prevailed on to relinquish the interests of the Norman prince, exerted himself to effect an accommodation between the two monarchies, and his endeavours being crowned with success, a peace was concluded at the commencement of the year 1119. The terms of this treaty were that all the castles and fortified places which had been taken in the course of the last war should be restored on both sides, and that Henry should do homage for Normandy to the French monarch. But Henry, esteeming it as a degradation of his royal dignity to do this homage in person, sent his son Prince William, to do it for him, who then received the investiture of that duchy from the hands of the King of France. In 1120, when Henry had restored tranquillity to his continental dominions, he embarked at Barfleur on his return to England on the evening of the 25th of November, and arrived on the English coast the next morning. One of the finest vessels in the fleet, called the White Ship, was allotted to his son, Prince William, and his numerous retinue, who, being detained by some accident, ordered 3 casks of wine to be distributed to the ship's crew, by which means many of them became intoxicated, and the captain himself, Thomas Fitzstephens, was induced to exceed the bounds of sobriety. They failed about sunset, and being in a hurry to overtake the king, crowded all their sails, as well as plied their oars, when through the carelessness of the pilot the vessel struck on a sunken rock, called the Catteraz. Oh my gosh. Which with such violence that she started several planks, and was almost overset. The boat was immediately hoisted out, and the prince, with some of the chief nobility, entered it, and having got clear of the ship, might have reached the shore, which was not far distant, but affected by the shrieks of his natural sister Maud, Countess of Perche. He commanded the sailors to row back and attempt to save her. When the boat, however, approached the ship, where terror and despair had destroyed all distinction, and everyone was actuated by a natural impulse of self-preservation, such numbers leaped into it that it instantly sunk, and all on board perished. So the rescue failed. Everybody perished. On this occasion, besides the prince and his natural brother Richard, there were lost 18 ladies of the highest rank, 140 young noblemen of the principal families of England and Normandy, with all their attendants, and 50 sailors. A butcher of Rouen named Berthaud was the only one who escaped from this dreadful disaster. Being a robust man and warmly clothed, he climbed to the top of the mast, which remained above water, and there stayed till the next morning. When he was taken up by some fishermen. While he was in that perilous situation, Fitzstephens, the captain, swam up to him and laid hold of the mast, but being informed by Berthaud that Prince William had perished, he expressed his determination not to survive him, and instantly plunged into the sea. So the captain died after Prince William was announced as perished. 1121. So it sounds like it lilted to the side. It hit the rock. It took the planks, took on so much water, lilted to the side and sunk. And they all died except for this one butcher. Okay, so 1121 to 1123. The tragic, it was almost like the Titanic of the time, wasn't it, if you think about it? That many on board. This tragical event revived the hopes of the friends of William and the son of Robert and the Normans, who justly regarded Henry as a usurper, were anxious to transfer the ducal dignity to a prince whom they now considered as the last representative of their ancient dukes. A conspiracy was accordingly formed to put him in possession of Normandy, and was joined by many of those noblemen, in whom Henry had reposed the greatest confidence, and whose fidelity he had attempted to secure by a profusion of honours and rewards. Among these were Guerlain, Count of Moulins, and his brother Robert. The conspirators, too, received a considerable encouragement by the brother Robert. By the Cession of Foulques, not by Robert, by the Cession of Foulques, Count of Anjou, who, being released by the death of his son-in-law from those ties which had attached him to the interest of Henry, now embraced the party of William, and again promised to bestow on him in marriage his daughter Sibylla, who had formerly been contracted to him. Henry was no sooner apprised of the revolt than he hastened to suppress it. He failed from Portsmouth in the summer of 1123, and arriving safe on the Norman coast, marched to attack the insurgents. Before they were prepared to receive him, took several of their castles and defeated them in different skirmishes. In 1124, in the spring of the succeeding year, the English monarch had good fortune to take the leaders of the conspiracy by surprise, and to secure their persons. Discouraged by this unlucky accident, all the other barons who had joined in the revolt hastened to return to their allegiance, and to make peace with him on the best terms they could procure. Henry, too, soon after found means to detach the Count Anjou from the League. That nobleman, seeing the confederacy in a great measure dissolved, they were consented to be reconciled. It does say dissolved. It does say dissolved. For some reason it says dissolved. In great measure dissolved, consented to be reconciled to him, and to dissolve the contract of marriage that had been lately formed between Prince William and his daughter, who, though twice affianced, had never consummated the marriage, and now he's sunk in the boat. Okay, so still, however, the King of France continued to make the most formidable preparations for war, and troops were collecting on every side. Henry, aware of his intentions, was resolved to anticipate him, and therefore began hostilities by making incursions on the domains of his rival. He also engaged his son-in-law, Henry V, Emperor of Germany, to make a powerful diversion in his favour. On the side of Champagne, the prince accordingly raised a numerous army for the purpose of forming the siege of Rheims, while Louis, apprised of his plans, ordered all the vassals of the crown to meet him under the walls of that city on a particular day. Oddly, we're not getting any mourning going on with a lot of these kings. The book is not really going into that. Maybe later by their death, and it brings a slight mourning in. But yeah, we almost expected it just then from Henry, but we didn't get it. I believe it should have been Henry, and that was his son, right? It is necessary to remark on this occasion, or at least a brother or something, I'll have to go back with it on one of the genealogy charts. It is necessary to remark on this occasion the difference which subsisted in the times we are now delineating between the forces of the kingdom and those of the king. When the sovereign went to war for the promotion of his own private interest, he had no more troops than what he could collect on the immediate domains of the crown. But when the general welfare of the nation was at stake, all domestic dissensions instantly ceased. Every man flew to arms, and every vassal marched with a certain number of troops, proportioned to the extent and dignity of his fief. But the kingdom had not for a long time witnessed so numerous an assemblage of armed men as now appeared in the field. Noblemen, citizens, priests, and monks all became soldiers. The districts of Rheims and Chalon alone supplied more than 60,000 men. Laon and Soissons furnished an equal force. The countries of Orléans, Etampes, and Paris sent the same number into the field. Even the counts of Champagne and Troyes joined the other vassals of the crown, preferring the interests of their country to any advantage they might reap from an alliance with the King of England. These noblemen commanded the 4th division of the army. The 5th, consisting of the Burgundians, was placed under the orders of their duke and of the Count Nevers. Rodolphe, Count of Vermandois, a prince of the blood royal, divided his troops into 2 bodies, those of Saint-Quentin and Vermandois. Armed Capapier were placed on the right wing, and those of Ponceau, Amiens, and Beauvais took their station on the left. The Count of Flanders, too, hastened to the defence of the kingdom, followed by 10,000 experienced soldiers who formed in the rear. Never, says Suger, abbot of Saint-Denis, who attended the expedition with the dependents of his abbey, had the kings of the 3rd race seen themselves at the head of such a numerous army. The quota furnished by the Ile of France, Champagne, and Picardy are alone said to have amounted to more than 200,000 men. The emperor, alarmed at the immensity of these preparations, repassed the Moselle and the Rhine with the utmost precipitation. The soldiers, enraged at what they conceived to be a symptom of cowardice, loudly demanded to be led into the German territories, that they might chastise an enemy who had dared to interrupt the repose of the kingdom. But Louis, at the solicitation of the clergy, checked with impetuosity and disbanded the army. He would most willingly have employed it against the King of England, but the interests of the prince and his vassals were essentially different, as what tended to aggrandize the one must of necessity weaken the other. Those very nobles who had taken up arms with so much zeal against a foreign prince who had threatened to invade the kingdom would have refused to march against a vassal whom it was their interest to support, in order to balance the power of the crown. In that age, they made a material distinction between the wars of the nation and the wars of the sovereign. On this memorable, yeah, well, it doesn't put the M there. Memorable, it should be. On this memorable occasion, the celebrated Oriflamme, the banner of Saint Denis, was first unfurled. So it looks like a big show of troops to scare everybody off, and it worked. 1125, 1127. While Louis was thus engaged in Champagne, the incursions of the English monarch on the side of Normandy were successfully opposed by Amaury de Montfort, supported by the troops of the Vexin, and Henry, having appeased the troubles in Normandy, was constrained to listen to terms of accommodation, and a durable peace was at length concluded. But no sooner had Louis arranged the terms of accommodation with the King of England than he was obliged to march to the assistance of the Church of Clermont, whose bishop, having been forcibly expelled from his fee by the Count, from his see, by the Count of Auvergne, claimed protection and redress from his sovereign. He speedily reduced to obedience his rebellious vassal, and restored the injured prelate to his just rights. But though he was ever eager to defend the privileges and possessions of the Church, he could never secure the gratitude nor respect of the clergy. They loudly complained that the king interred in the nomination to vacant benefices, and infringed on their revenue. Inferred. Let's go back. Not interred. I'm not putting them in that. No, inferred in their nomination to vacate the benefices. Okay, sorry, that was a big boo-boo word. Okay. Their murmurs were carried to such a dangerous height that Louis, in order to reduce them to submission, was constrained to have recourse to violence, and to seize upon some lands belonging to the Archbishop of Sens and the Bishop of Paris. The last, whose name was Stephen, employed by the thunder, yeah, I'm getting poet here, employed the thunder of the Church against that very sovereign who had proved himself its most zealous protector. But Honorius II, he then filled the chair of St. Peter, declared the sentence of excommunication pronounced by Stephen to be abusive, and accordingly annulled it. The French prelates were highly offended at an interference thus hostile to the authority they wished to assume, and Bernard, abbot of Clairvaux, warmly remonstrated with the sovereign pontiff on the impropriety of his conduct. "We hoped," said he, "that the severity of the prelate would have effected the conversion of the prince. Your misplaced indulgence has destroyed those hopes. All is lost, the prelacy dishonored, and religion exposed to the insults of libertines." But as this pompous epistle produced no effect on the mind of the sovereign pontiff, he wrote a second in a more peremptory style, The zealous abbot there observes that Louis is always ready to attack religion, which he regards as the pest of his dominions and the enemy of his crown. He is a second Herod who seeks to destroy Jesus, no longer an infant in the manger, but triumphing in his church. He is a persecutor, in short, whose malignant shafts are not so much directed against the prelates of his kingdom as against the Spirit of God, by which they are animated. Whoa, Louis, better watch it. They're going to give you a devil next. This spirit of fanaticism was, in those days of ignorance, dignified by the appellation of religious zeal. But Louis, notwithstanding this dangerous display of priestly arrogance, conducted himself with temper and moderation, and by that means speedily concluded a peace between the mitre and the crown. All right. So the papacy is, I guess, very upset. Charles of Denmark, who had succeeded his cousin Baldwin in the Principality of Flanders, fell a victim to the discontents of his subjects and was assassinated at Brugge. Louis hastened to punish the assassins and inflicted on them the most exemplary vengeance. As Charles had left no children, the vacant earldom was disputed by the various claimants. The chief of these were Baldwin, Count of Mon, one of whose ancestors had been unjustly deprived of this country. Arnold of Denmark, son to the sister of Charles, Thierry, Count of Alsace, the son of Gertrude, sister to Robert the Frisian, Stephen of Blois, brother to the Count of Champagne, and William, son to Robert, Duke of Normandy. So these are the ancestors who were unjustly deprived of this country. The king was to decide the matter, because Flanders was a fief of the French crown. He therefore transferred the dukedom to William, probably with the view to render him a more formidable enemy to the King of England. 1128. Henry was fully aware of the designs of Louis, and in order to strengthen his own influence on the continent and to diminish that of his rival, he determined to secure the friendship of the potent but fickle Count of Anjou. With this view he proposed an alliance between his daughter Matilda, widow to the Emperor of Germany, and Geoffrey, surnamed Plantagenet, the eldest son of Fulk, with which cheerfully accepted by a nobleman, who was too apt to sacrifice his honour to his interest. The nuptials were celebrated at Rouen with great pomp and magnificence in the summer of 1128, but the Norman barons were highly displeased that a step in which the interests of their country were so essentially concerned, should have been taken without their previous consent, and that Henry had too sensibly experienced the turbulence of their disposition not to dread the effects of their resentment. It seemed probable that the party of his nephew might gain a considerable accession of strength from the increase of the malcontents, and the important addition of power which William had recently acquired rendered his pretensions still more alarming. Impressed with these ideas, Henry resolved to support the claims of Thierry of Alsace to the county of Flanders, which gave rise to a war in which William was generally victorious. But having received a wound in the hand of a trifling skirmish, a mortification unfortunately ensued, which put an end to his existence. On the 27th of July, 1128, at the Abbey of Saint Brétine. Ordericus Vitalis says that when we found his death approaching, he wrote to Henry to express his concern for the trouble he had caused him, and to request, with an earnestness which evinced the goodness of his heart, that he would receive into his favour Hélie de Saint-Brun, Hélie de Saint-Seine, and a few other friends, whom no reverse of fortune had ever induced to forsake him. The death of this unfortunate prince, whose nobility of manners and urbanity of manners, I'm not sure what urbanity means here, but it's a word there, and undaunted courage, and secured him, maybe he's just more modern and he's up to date on manners, and secured him the love and esteem of all who knew him, released his ambitious uncle from those jealous fears and very anxious inquietudes which, since his usurpation of Normandy, had never ceased to disturb his tranquillity. In 1129, the fatigues of war, more than the ravages of time, had visibly impaired the health of Louis, who, in order to avoid those dissensions which were but too common on the death of a king, followed the example of his predecessors in the association of his son Philip to the throne. That prince was crowned at Rheims by Archbishop Raymond, but he did not long survive his elevation to the regal dignity. A fall from his horse proved fatal to the young prince, and the favourable expectations of a future reign, which had been raised by his early virtues, were blasted by his premature death. The loss of Philip was followed by the coronation of his brother Louis, who, at the age of 12 years, received the crown from the hands of Pope Innocent II. 1130 to 1137. The kingdom now enjoyed a state of perfect tranquillity. The inflexible justice of the sovereign had secured his subjects from the oppression of those petty tyrants who infested his dominions on the accession to the throne, and the great vassals of the crown, convinced at length that the views of Louis were honourable, were induced to repose that confidence in him which they had hitherto withheld from his predecessors. But the approach of disease embittered the happiest moments of his life, and prevented him from enjoying in that plenitude of gratification which he so richly merited. The glorious reward of his virtuous labours he lived, however, to witness the aggrandizement of his son by an honourable alliance and an important addition of territory. William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, having resolved to undertake a pilgrimage to St. James of Compostela, declared his eldest daughter, Eleanor, sole heiress of his dominions, on condition that she should marry the king's eldest son. The marriage was accordingly celebrated at Bordeaux with great magnificence, and the Duke dying on his pilgrimage, young Louis obtained immediate possession of Poitou, Gascony, Biscay, and a large tract of country extending to the Pyrenees. The new married couple then repairing to Poitiers, the prince was solemnly crowned Duke of Guyenne, a title which he preserved after his accession to the throne. But the king had scarce time to embrace his daughter-in-law before he sunk beneath the pressure of his disease, and expired at Paris in 1137. In the 13th year of his reign and the 60th of his age. 60th. In the 30th year of his reign, okay, and 60th of his age. So he was quite old in reign, okay. Of Louis the Gross, it has been said, he might have made a better king. He could not prove a better man. He might have made a better king. He could not prove a better man. So they say he would have been he could have been a better king, but he was a very good man. All right. The eulogy is just and comprehends the character in a few words, but still that Louis was an excellent monarch will not admit of a doubt. Impartial to the administration of justice, vigorous in the suppression of tyranny, and eager in promoting the welfare and happiness of his subjects, he discharged the first duties of sovereignty with propriety, wisdom, and effect. That he entertained a just sense of the nature and importance of the royal dignity is evident from his last admonition to his son and successor. "Remember, my son," said the expiring monarch, "that royalty is a public trust, for the exercise of which a rigorous account will be exacted from you by him who has the sole disposal of crowns and sceptres." Louis the Gross had 8 children by Adelaide of Savoy, Philip, who died before his father, Louis surnamed the Young, who succeeded him in the throne, Henri, who first assumed the monastic habit at Clairvaux, was afterwards made Bishop of Beauvais, and next promoted to the archiepiscopal see of Rheims. Robert founded the house of Dreux, whose grandson Peter, surnamed Mauclerc, acquired the county of Brittany by his marriage with the heiress of that principality. Few of whose fate no mention is made in history. Nothing known of you. Peter, who had by Isabella, heiress of Courtenay, a numerous offspring, whose descendants are still in existence. Philip, Archdeacon of Paris and Constance, first married to Eustace, Count of Boulogne, and afterwards to Raymond I, Count of Toulouse and Duke of Narbonne. We have already had occasion to remark that in the early times of the French monarchy, ecclesiastics and military men were the only people in the kingdom who were free. The other inhabitants of cities, towns, and villages were all slaves, though not in an equal degree. They were divided into two classes. The first, called serfs, were attached to the soil. So they were the agriculturists attached to the soil and transferred with the trees that grew upon it from one proprietor to another, neither being able to marry nor to change their residence or possession without the permission of their master. The whole produce of their labor was his, except he chose to release them from this obligation on condition of receiving a stipulated sum at stated periods, as well for the serf himself as for his wife and children. The second class, denominated hommes de poète, were not so immediately dependent on their lord, who had no power over their lives or property. All their servitude consisted in the obligation of paying him certain duties, and of repairing his roads. And highways. They actually used the term highways in those days. But neither of these descriptions of men had any other judge than the lord of the soil, nor any other law. Yeah, it is soil. I don't believe it's soil. I believe it is soil. Than any other law than what he chose to enact. Hence it was that so many crimes remained unpunished. So they were all slaves, unless you were in the ecclesiastics or a royalty, some sort. Whoa. Since the nobles themselves were, generally speaking, the immediate perpetrators of the numerous assassinations and other lawless proceedings so frequent throughout the kingdom, in such cases where justice could not be obtained in the usual course, since the judge, the legislator, and the culprit were centered in the same person, the injured party had recourse to the authority of the prince, who issued his orders to the lord, in whose territory the crime had been committed, to see that strict justice was administered. On his refusal to comply with the royal mandate, he summoned the other vassals of the crown to join him with their stipulated number of men, in order to reduce the rebel to submission. But often the royal authority was not more respected than the laws. Even the towns within his own domain were frequently inapt in supplying their contingency. So I believe the nobles, I can't get out of this if the nobles were slaves also, but in a way, I sense that, they had to do the bidding of the king. Didn't they? They had to. There was no choice. But I believe they are more the masters of the slaves, of being, and their final master being the king. So seems to be like that. So I don't believe they are class of slaves. Louis, in order to remedy these abuses and at the same time to create some power that might counterbalance those potent vassals who controlled or gave law to the crown, first adopted the plan of conferring new privileges on the towns situated within his own domain. These privileges were called charters of community, by which he enfranchised the inhabitants, abolished all marks of servitude, and formed them into corporations, or bodies politique, to be governed by a council and magistrates of their own nomination. These magistrates had the right of administering justice within their own precincts, of levying taxes, of embodying and training to arms the militia of their town. It wasn't theirs, which took the field when required by the sovereign, under the command of officers appointed by the community. The great barons, by degrees, began to imitate the example of their monarch, and granted similar immunities to the towns within their territories. They had expended such immense sums in their expeditions to the Holy Land. Well, to the Holy Land, yes. That they were eager to embrace this new expedient for raising money by the sale of those charters of liberty. Though the institution of community was as repugnant to their maxims of policy as it was adverse to their power, they disregarded remote consequences in order to obtain present relief. In less than 2 centuries, servitude was abolished in most of the towns in France, and they became free corporations instead of dependent villages without jurisdiction or privileges. So now more privileges are coming into these towns. They are free corporations. Yeah, I'll take a break there. But it goes on. I'm not finished. It's a long history.